Okay, I think we should start. Everyone is in agreement. So an official welcome to anyone that's joined the webinar or is watching on record, and to my panelists as well. Welcome to the Oxford HR Knowledge Festival 2024. So my name is Zoe. I'm the Head of Environment, Climate and Conservation Sector Area at Oxford HR, and today's facilitator as well. So thank you so much for being here. Oxford HR, if you don't know, is a global leadership consultancy focused on recruiting exceptional leaders for the sector. And the Knowledge Festival is a series of webinars where we discuss important issues relevant to leadership in social and environmental work. So this today is the first of 5 sessions happening throughout the week as part of the Knowledge Festival. So later in the week, you can hear about talent in the ESG space, changing narratives in conservation, power dynamics in philanthropy, and EU legislation changes affecting not-for-profits. So the link will be in the chat to sign up to those other webinars if you'd like to join. And of course, as usual, you can watch those on record afterwards if you wish to as well, but do sign up so you get that recording. So today's session will explore inclusive leadership in the environment sector and the research report of the same name that Oxford HR is due to release next week. So if you have, again, if you've signed up to this webinar, you will automatically receive that research report when it's published on Monday. Now, it's a huge topic. We could explore the words inclusive, leadership, and environment for the rest of the day. We don't have time to do that, but to frame our discussion in the time that we do have, I will share some key findings, insights, and reflections from the research that we've undertaken, and our fabulous panel here will use that for discussion points and to share thoughts and experiences as well. So that's our plan for the day. There will be some slides, so we'll share those in a moment. And of course, if anybody listening to this has questions, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A box. We will be keeping an eye on that, and we would absolutely love to respond to your questions, not just our own. So please do encourage you to do that. So before we get started, let me warmly welcome my panel guests, Grace, Noora and Susanne. Really glad to have you here with us today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy Mondays to be here. We should start with some introductions, and I would love to ask you to introduce yourselves briefly, but please don't be too modest because we know that you're all wonderful and have done many amazing things, so we'd love to hear that. And I'd also like to ask you, when you're introducing yourselves, to share a couple of thoughts on what inclusive leadership means to you. So let me start with Grace, and then I will come to Noora and then Susanne, if I may. Grace, over to you.
Thanks, Zoe, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today speaking to you all. My name is Grace Mansah-Owusu. I am an organisational psychologist at Oxford HR. I've been working within the sector for about 5 years. I also worked at a previous charity before Oxford HR in talent management, talent development. And one of my specialist areas is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I've done that work, again, across sectors, so education, consulting in private sector, public sector, and charity and non-for-profits. And that includes things like widening participation, barriers to access of careers, as well as creating employee resource groups internally, working across charities, all sorts of things, and I thoroughly enjoy it. So I'm very excited to be on this panel. I'm very excited to be on this panel and to hear from the rest of our esteemed panelists today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Grace. Really glad to have you here. And I know that you were also a co-author for this research as well. So it's brilliant that you're able to join us. Noora, can we come to you next?
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you for having me, and welcome to all those who have joined to be part of this discussion as well. My name is Noora Firaq. I grew up in the Maldives, so climate change is often very personal and emotional to me, and that's where my passion is, and that's where I've decided to spend my skills and professional expertise in making change happen. I'm Deputy CEO of Climate Outreach, and I'm also a board member of Westmill Wind Co-op Energy Co-operative. My mission and my organization's mission is rewriting the climate story. Why rewrite the climate story? Because we feel, especially I feel, that the current climate narratives and story doesn't necessarily reflect the plight and the experiences and the journeys most people who are mostly affected by climate doesn't reflect their stories. So I'm all about having a more inclusive conversation when it comes to climate change and climate conversation, from causes, solution, impact, and all the whole 360 sort of conversation. And for me, what is inclusive leadership? Inclusive leadership is sort of two elements for me. Number one is really making sure, as a leader, making the structural and cultural changes or components or facets that's necessary for everybody from all walks of life to be involved, and also creating a structure and a culture that doesn't exacerbate the negative impacts of our historical legacy and doesn't create an environment that doesn't allow people from marginalized and excluded communities to thrive. So that's one aspect of it. And for me, the second aspect of inclusive leadership is, as a leader personally, I need to be on a journey, challenge my own learnings and assumptions, and keep unlearning and learning and unlearning and learning, and meet where the movement and people need at that particular moment. And I think that's slightly different, the moment in climate sector versus a movement in refugee sector. So it's about, really meeting that moment that the society and the social movement itself needs. So it's many things, Zoe, many things. Thank you.
I know you've got lots more to share. Thank you. And I think, Grace, did you get away with what environmental inclusive leadership means to you?
Sorry,
Shall we just pop back to you for that one before we move on?
It slipped my mind, Zoe, I promise. Thank you, Noora, for sharing your example. And I think mine is very similar, it's along the same lines. So inclusive leadership is not just about individuals trying to figure out themselves. It includes all the systems working together to create an environment where people can actually thrive. People from marginalized backgrounds, that could be based on gender, caste, race, age, religion, and the list could go on. Making sure that there's measurement. So what's going on? Are people progressing at the same level? If they're not, why could that be? Speaking to them, understanding your own biases, and creating an environment where people can actually thrive within whatever it is that you're trying to create. So if it's a workplace where you do work with frontline people and also you're working with communities, are those communities being considered in whatever it is that you're doing? Are they actually at the forefront, and are you being an ally? And when I say being an ally, it's not about making your thoughts and ideas paramount. It's actually listening to the people who are marginalized and making sure they are actually in the decision making, and they're the ones that you're creating things for, not the other way around. So yeah, that's what inclusive leadership means to me.
Thank you so much, Grace. Susanne, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm Susanne Pedersen, and I'm, of course, very happy to be part of this panel. I think if I were to summarize my career, because it's a rather long career by now, I've really had, let's say, started out working in the sort of consulting engineering sector for many years as a board member, director, project program director, strategic advisor, with global responsibility within sort of climate, energy, environment, including biodiversity and nature protection. And then after many years, I left the private sector and went and joined, you could say, a public-private partnership addressing climate change through innovation. I've also worked for industry associations, a science-based advisory center, and international organizations. And currently, I'm into my second year as the Director for Science and Knowledge at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, which is based in around the Geneva Lake in Switzerland. And I think when I was reflecting on what inclusive leadership means to me, I think I realized that over the course of I would say, a rather long career, things have changed dramatically over those years. And there's also, I would say, a difference between how we probably viewed it in the private sector and now in more international organizations. That is not to say that the private sector has not sort of also evolved over the years, but in the last 10 years have been sort of more in the non-profit sector. But looking back, I think I was always very conscious about, you could say, being a woman in also a man-dominated area, and working with other women, trying to promote other women, and also giving, let's say, other women chances to grow. And I also, in my entire career, I've actually focused on youth, in the sense that I've always been eager to give young people chances, but also to give them assignments and tasks, and even, in some cases, perhaps even challenging young people, perhaps beyond their comfort zone. But I definitely saw that that was a way to grow for young people. So I really focused a lot on that across my career. But later, I think certainly by joining international organizations, I've also seen that inclusive leadership means something else in international organizations, where there is a lot more focus on, I think, as also Grace said, access to opportunities, equal treatment in the recruitment, let's say, part of the job, and also representation, securing representation from all, let's say, walks of life, but also from all geographical regions, all, let's say, well, races, all, let's say, religions, and so forth. So it takes on, I would say, a slightly different perspective. So, for instance, in the private sector, when we worked globally, we did work with God knows how many international experts, but we mostly recruited the experts from, let's say, securing representation from countries we work with, or, promoting people with a good cultural understanding, the right language skills to reflect the geographical realities we worked in. So although we did work and included lots of different people, it was not a conscious decision to create diversity. It was more possibly to reflect the, let's say, the collaboration we had with various countries. And then we saw the clear need for including people with the strong knowledge of the both the politics, the culture, etc., of specific countries. But so it has certainly changed for me the perspective and the way I need to work with this as a leader. So I think I will stop there, and I'm sure we'll get more into some of the details of this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Susanne. And we will absolutely. You started to touch on some of the things we'll bring up. You're all coming at this from actually quite different places, different experience, and it's really wonderful to hear your personal experiences. Let's talk a little bit about the research now. And for anyone that's just joined us on this webinar, we're talking about inclusive leadership in the environment sector. Oxford HR has recently done a piece of research into this subject, which we are publishing next Monday. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let's hope that works. Just give me a moment. Hopefully everyone can see a screen now. Let's put that on screen share. I'm getting some nods from the panel, so hopefully you can see that. Okay, I'm not going to leave the screen up, the slides up all of the time, because I think it's nice to see people's faces, but let's just have a quick look at what we're talking about here. So the research that we have done at Oxford HR, the purpose of the research was to explore barriers to inclusivity in the environmental sector specifically, and to identify actionable solutions to promote diversity. And I think, we're all aware that this is a This is a sector that's grappling with some of the biggest challenges of our time: climate change, biodiversity loss, sustainable resource management, etc. And so the need for diverse perspectives, inclusive participation has really never been so important. And it is a movement, and it is a sector that has waged criticism for being quite exclusionary, I would say, both internally and externally in how it works. So this research adds to, I think, a body of knowledge which is already emerging, and certainly, you know, we're increasing our understanding of this. So our goal with this research was to provide strategic direction, offer solutions, and to help organisations evolve. And hopefully we will start to do a bit of that today. Let's just have a quick look at who we spoke to in brief. So 256 respondents to a survey, but also in-depth interviews with people across the sector as well. And that followed analysis looking for trends. Now, brief note on demographics: 40% female, 57% male in terms of people who responded to us and spoke to us. 40%, nearly 41% of respondents considered themselves from an underrepresented group. And we can see people identified as working internationally and regionally there. Now, the categories are interesting. They did move across, the people we spoke to moved across many different categories that you could say are broadly connected to the environmental space. So sustainability and ESG, nature and biodiversity, advocacy, climate justice, climate policy, conservation and wildlife, energy transition, climate finance, waste, plastics, and climate funding. Wow, so many different areas. So we were able to identify some trends across these different subcategories of the sector, and commonalities as well. So let's see, it's our first slide, I think, for discussion with the panel. Kind of top line key findings. I'll share the key findings in top line. We'll then look at, you know, perhaps what some of the problems are, and then go into what we might do about that. And of course, there's a lot more detail in the report itself, so do download it when you can. Now, 57.2 people who responded to this research had witnessed or experienced some form of discrimination. The highest discrimination witnessed was noted in North America, followed by Europe. And these varied, I'd say the kind of themes varied across the sector areas. We had, for example, a kind of renewable sector, circular economy space, identifying particularly as quite male dominated, more challenges for female leaders. One of the common themes in the conservation wildlife space was a lack of consistent funding, which meant that efforts around EDI were often kind of well-intentioned, but then not followed through because of a, you know, funding delay or whatever that meant it wasn't fully embedded. Now, we can go into all sorts of reasons for why this is the situation, but I'd love just to pause there actually and get some responses from the panel in terms of whether this is surprising or you know, whether there's anything that you want to add to this slide in terms of your own thoughts. Open floor for anyone that wants to jump in.
I can
Go
start.
for it, Grace. Yeah.
When I saw the findings initially, and I've seen this report from its early stages, I wasn't surprised. It does go along with a lot of the other kind of reports that are similar in other sectors. The findings, I would say, are quite aligned. One of the things I did want to kind of comment on is the regional insight. So North America and Europe having higher levels. And I think that might be to do with like what people's perception of discrimination is, people's understanding of it, legislation around it, and conversations around it. So the last 4.5 years, we've seen a lot more speaking, more talk and rhetoric around discrimination, because there's been so many movements after a lot of atrocities and injustices that are going on in the world, in specifically those regions, also in other regions. But I think the communication and the messaging around inclusion and diversity in those areas is probably, you know, it's been very vocal and it's been very clear. So that could be why the numbers are higher in those regions. That's just a speculation. I'd love to hear other people's perspectives.
Noora, would you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. It isn't surprising for me. 57.2% in reality, I feel like maybe slightly low than what I observe and experience, really. I think it's easy for us to observe for all the reasons, Grace, you've mentioned about the rhetoric and the conversations we are having recently, to observe and to be able to call out when it is overt or direct discrimination, but is less obvious to many of us when it is systemic or indirect, especially when it is systemic. And I think, you know, the 57.2% is actually low from my perspective. I don't know any person of color or a woman who doesn't have a story around the discrimination they experience, but it's very difficult to vocalize it when there is not enough vocabulary in professional setting to be able to talk about it, and number two, the language around that somehow needs to be normalized in a professional setting before people can. A good example will be, you know, I remember a long time ago, I didn't have the language of unconscious bias, and I was trying to explain unconscious bias, the thing I'm feeling, but, you know, English language being my second language as well, I also struggle to articulate it. And then, you know, with recent events over the past 4 years, unconscious bias became a popularized word and normalized as something less threatening. And then suddenly, when I explain the same thing to the same people who don't remember it back then, they suddenly understand it. So I think that in itself is a discrimination as well that we don't really see and we don't really call out. That language needs to be often normalized by the ruling or the dominant groups of people who hold the power for it to be acceptable and be named. So I think we need to dissect what discrimination we're talking about a little bit. I really appreciate that one research is not going to give all the answers, but I would love to see these stats being taken in and then another research piece being commissioned to actually dive a little bit deeper into what do the respondents mean here by discrimination? What are the discriminations that's been observed and not being seen and heard? I think that's for me a really key thing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, normalizing language and kind of surprised that actually this is quite low. It was that was my response too. Susanne, did you want to reflect on anything before I move on?
Yes, I do, and I think I'm definitely, you know, I hear also what Noora is saying about unconscious bias and all that. I think I've sort of lived and worked in 6 different countries, both in Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. But I worked in more than 100 countries, and I'm a little bit surprised myself that the percentage is so high, and I'm not sure what it is reflective of completely. As I said, I've had a long career and certainly worked 2/3 of it in the private sector and 1/3 in sort of international in a non-for-profit sector. And if you look at, for instance, what I experienced in the private sector, it was probably a rather, I would say, performance achievement-based culture where salary, opportunities, everything was very much about whether you met your KPIs, you exceeded your KPIs, and so forth. So there, I definitely saw in some ways that, you know, everyone had, at least in a way, opportunities to excel, and were perhaps also given new chances or challenges on the basis of, let's say, I guess, how they met their achievements. And that could be, that was rather subjective in some ways, although you know, everyone tried to perform metrics around it, etc. But there was a certain element of subjectivity. You know, did you do well or did you not do well? Whereas in the international organizations and, you know, the non-for-profit sector, I think people are rated as was said earlier, or it's much more about where you positioned in your grade, and are you, let's say, rewarded in the same fashion as your peers in the same grade with the same years of experience, etc. I think it's definitely much more objective, the way that people are being either rewarded or placed in categories, etc. I really feel, compared to possibly what I've experienced before, that there's a lot more objectivity to the way that you know, people are being, I would say, placed or graded or whatever. So I'm a little bit surprised at seeing such a high number, at least in the sector that we are perhaps talking about right now, where I think a lot of efforts have actually been done on behalf of these type of organizations to try to avoid that unconscious bias, or and make things as objective as possible. I
Okay.
actually see it slightly differently, but I recognize it. And of course, even in the current organization I'm working in, we are also seeing that some people don't feel that they get maybe the opportunities they deserve. And so it is there, and I would love to dig deeper into this as well. Thank you.
So slightly different perspectives there, and kind of sense of surprise or not. Grace, did you want to come in at all on any of that? I think your work means that you do have a sense perhaps of how different types of organizations are interpreting this. You know, I won't keep us here too long. I'll move on to the next slide in a minute, but I feel like maybe there's a reflection from you that might be useful here.
Yeah, and I've worked and consulted with international organizations, private sector, public sector, as I said before, in terms of, because I think what we were alluding to is like, some people might see it as the workplace is very meritocratic, especially in this sector or in other sectors. But the research suggests that biases are there. So when we look at things like recruitment, levels of recruitment, people in senior levels of organizations, when we're looking at performance management and performance ratings, when we're looking at rates of redundancies being made, a lot of organizations, regardless of the sector, there is evidence of discrimination from different marginalized groups. That includes gender, that includes age, that includes race and ethnicity, that also includes things like levels of education and socioeconomic status of those individuals. So when you look across the board, it's happening, but to an individual level, it might be that individuals are not seeing it play out in the way they think it might happen. So when Noora spoke about explicit discrimination or explicit exclusion, where people might go and point a finger and say something very clearly to an individual, that kind of stuff doesn't happen as much anymore. What we're getting is very subjective levels of discrimination. So when we talk about in things like unconscious bias, the term unconscious bias is actually a psychological concept, and it's been around for decades. Like, people have recognized it for decades. The underlying factor is called implicit associations. So we make stories and we make shortcuts, mental shortcuts with our brains every single day. But I could go on and on about biases all day long. It helps us to be able to make decisions quickly as human beings, but sometimes those decisions malfunction, and because we rely on those biases and those associations that we've made with things, and they're not always accurate. So that's why you sometimes make decisions based on what you might think is fact, but it's actually opinions. So things like people are more likely to hire people that are like them. That's called affinity bias. So that's why you see in boards and with politicians and lots of different facets of society, you see people who are very homogenous. They're very similar to each other. They've gone to the same schools. They might even look similar. They sound similar. So that's what happens in organizations. And like I said, there's lots of statistics, lots of evidence to suggest that's what's happening on a systematic scale as well as on an individual level. And this research was really looking at individuals rather than systemic issues, but it does kind of paint the same picture.
If I may come in, Zoe, on
yeah,
that.
please do. Yeah.
I do think we are making progress. As Susanne said, I think we're making progress for sure. I just thought I'll share a little bit story of when I first became a leader and tried to tackle this as a leader. I joined an organization that didn't have people of color, and I was the first person, and it's the person who's sort of, had some sort of power over the HR practices. I set out to make our organization objectively inclusive and take down the barriers that existed to enter. From my personal experience, I know the barriers that I face. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And after 2 years, we are celebrated as an organization to be quite diverse in the sector. I get maybe on average 2 messages every month from different parts of the sector to be like, how did you do it? Can you share all of that? But one observation that I made is that the people who were joining, who were able to, the barriers that I've broken down for them, actually they look like me, as Grace said. They look like me. They grew up either in South Asia or belong to a South Asian community, often spoke English as a second language, because I do as well. So I'm able to break the barriers in a very objective manner for a very specific thing for a specific group that related to my own community. But when it came to breaking the barriers for people who I don't belong as a community to, I had to do a lot more work. And I actually had to do a lot more work, and I have to actually look at myself and look at that community quite subjectively in my head, because without being able to look at it from a subjective lens, I wasn't able to see the biases and the barriers that I was holding and creating for those people. So I think there is something about being objective and meritocratic, but I think there's also a space here when we have conversations to be really subjective, because being subjective is actually seeing people's identity, and being subjective is also being able to see their experiences and the barriers they have.
Thank you so much for sharing, all of you. I think just your perspectives on this from working in the sector is so helpful. Just let me take us to the next slide, because it starts to touch on some of the things that we're saying. Actually, there is a statistic before we get there. I thought this was interesting. 95% of people agreed or strongly agreed that diversity is important for environmental initiatives. I mean, thank goodness. So that's encouraging. But where are we going wrong here? How are organizations struggling? What are some of the reasons that we're seeing some of the discrimination that we just saw on the previous slide? We have started to talk about some of these things already. Access to networks. So we're seeing homogenous groups dominate leadership, limiting visibility for diverse talent. Elitism, something I'd like to touch on what we mean by that. Probably a separate issue in many ways to non-inclusive recruitment, but particularly, and this was cited, I think in the conservation sector especially, a sense or a preference for certain academic backgrounds. And unpaid experience is another one. I mean, this is certainly how I started my career in conservation about 20 odd years ago, is, still, I was surprised this is still a widespread reliance, according to people that contributed to this report, on unpaid internships and kind of volunteering and that kind of model to get into this sector. Not necessarily all dimensions of it, but certainly some of it. So let's continue our conversation with this in mind. And I know you've all got things to say on this. We can take any of these topics and dive into them in a bit more detail. Where should we start? Is there are there things we can talk about to bring these areas to life? Are there things you've experienced? Are there things missing also? I'm going to stop the screen share for a minute so people can see our faces a bit more, but I will happily remind people of what's on the screen. Susanne, you're unmuted. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think you could say I definitely recognize a number of those, let's say, findings as I think are true and something I can definitely recognize. I would say the organization I work for, IUCN, I think working with nature conservation as our key area of work, we have definitely worked really, really hard to try to identify and include indigenous peoples and local community representatives. Because of course, in this particular sector, although they are only recognized as being 5% of the global population, they steward more than a quarter of the Earth's land and seas and protect 80% of biodiversity. So they are a really important voice that we need to, let's say, include in our conversations. And we are definitely, let's say, giving this a lot of thought. It's a key part of our strategy. We actively engage and try to give these groups a voice, but we also really try actively to recruit people from this IPLC community. And also, I think at IUCN, we are quite fortunate that we have a female president coming from the UAE, and now a female director general coming from Costa Rica. So I think we are definitely blessed with, not only strong female leadership, but also from, quite diverse culture. So I think this is a really great asset as well. On the academic backgrounds, elite academic institutions, I'm not so, at least from the experience I have now, I'm not so sure that this is a common thread elsewhere. Of course, in certain jobs, you do need a master's degree or possibly a PhD in some cases. But I don't think, as far as I'm aware, that we are looking particularly at which institutions people take their credentials from. But as long as they can, document that they have that level of education that will give them the right background to work for us. I think I'm definitely not aware that this is a factor when it comes to recruitment. However, on the internships, I actually fully agree. I've had interns for, 20, 25 years myself. I've had many interns, and I'm happy to say that many of the interns I've worked with have gone on to have really nice, good careers as well. But I've always paid for the internships because I started out my career as an intern, just like you did with the European Commission in Brussels. And at first, I was offered an unpaid internship that I simply couldn't afford to take. So I had to turn it down, and I had to wait for the next round and, really insist on a paid internship because even back then for me, it was just not possible. And I can imagine people, coming from countries where they have to travel very far to take an internship. It's certainly, the accommodation and travel costs are a huge burden, let alone if you're not paid for your internship. So I'm happy to say that at least for my entire career, I've been able to pay for interns, and that's a really important part. So I hope we can all continue with these internships as a really great entry-level experience and way into the sector. But, paying for certainly the actual sort of salary, and maybe considering if we can find ways to sponsor accommodation travel as well, that would probably help to spread the internship possibility for many different groups around the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Who wants to come in next? Anyone have any different opinions on that? Thinking about elitism with the sector, exceptionalism. I know, Noora, this is something that we've spoken about. Is this a good time to bring that up?
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, the challenges to diversity and inclusion, something that we're not seeing here under is that something that Susanne, you touched upon. There's an increasing recognition now that Indigenous peoples are custodians of nature, and they have the solutions and the wisdom when it comes to protecting our natural world. I think what we're not seeing is a recognition that people who have been born and living with the worst impacts of climate also know the adaptation solutions and the mitigation solutions we need. So, you know, that challenge is there. A way I describe it is that I've been in millions of conversations around adaptation and mitigation, but nobody asks me, how did my community adapt to climate change? It's a bit like, you know, a group of men having a discussion about women's rights and how to include women, but without asking the secretary at the back in the day who's in the room. So, you know, I really welcome and I love hearing what Susanne said. And I am seeing even in COP spaces on social media a growing recognition for the wisdom and the knowledge of Indigenous people, and we should continue that. But I would say, you know, we still have a bias in our brain that we don't know to say, actually, there are people who has been adapting and have brilliant solutions, technological, social solutions, and they've been, you know, born and tackling with climate change for their entire life. Why don't we invite them and ask them, what shall we do? We're still not doing that. We're still in the mindset of, you know, we know better and we're going to go and ask the opinion of those rather than, you know, include them, but not quite respecting them enough. So I think there's an empathy and a respect piece that goes a long way. And I think if you speak to any Indigenous group, they will say, you know, they've given a lot to be able to get to a position of recognition. But there are communities, especially the island community, who don't have the resources and who haven't been yet seen and heard. So I think that's the biggest challenge, not being able, not having that respect and not being heard and seen first. With regards to the elitism, I think I'll share a personal story, if I may.
Please.
So I came to UK as an international student. I went to business school and then I went to law school. I had a really good career at Financial Ombudsman Service, and I started getting myself into management roles and things like that. And I never considered a career in climate change sector, even though I really wanted to in UK, because it wouldn't fund the sort of salary that my visa requirements needed. It was just like, I don't have that privilege. I can't even think about it. I wouldn't even allow myself to dream about it. I fell in love and got married to a lovely European person. So because we settled here, I suddenly got European Union rights as a family member. And it was like, oh, I can actually think about having a career. I can actually think about what am I most passionate about and do something about. That passionate ability to imagine and dream is not something a lot of people can afford when you're from a community of color, even if they're born here and second generation. Reason being, they will have lots of barriers like other sort of, you know, caring commitments and things on. We can go into a little bit more detail later. So recognition that you need that kind of ability to be able to say at a young age, I'm going to go and apply for that internship, even if that is paid. Paid internship should exist, and I do not want to see a world where it stops. But I also think we need to recognize being able to participate in a paid internship itself is also a form of privilege. And there needs to be other forms of access routes that the most people who are excluded can continue. So this is in no way saying paid internships shouldn't exist. They should, but it isn't enough. That's the first thing. So when I started trying to get a job, I started applying to all climate related organizations. First, I started at managerial levels because that's what the recruiters advised me. I have experience, transferable skills, my previous employers, and all of that. But I didn't even get an interview. I couldn't understand, like with 2 degrees and a good career in a non-profit sector, but I still couldn't get an interview. And I started applying for junior and junior to the point of a receptionist. And I still couldn't get, and I eventually decided to call 10 organizations and ask for feedback. They all had one thing to say: you haven't had any experience in the climate and environment sector. That's what we need. And I just couldn't believe it. Like, even to be a receptionist, do we really need that? Can you not give me a chance? So I ended up actually taking a job in the charity sector, which isn't a climate and environment sector, a charity that was quite frankly about to fold. So a job that nobody else really wanted, and be paid for 1 day a week, but a full-time role, to show that I can work in a charity managerial role. And to make ends meet, I also had to take 2 other jobs. One of them was quite physically challenging caring responsibilities. Now, I was able to take that time and do that because my husband had a job, but because we don't come from wealthy families, we also had a debt for our education. So the impact of this is that it exacerbated our debt situation. I was working 3 jobs round the clock, one physically really, really challenging. I am eternally grateful for the skills that I learned during that caring responsibility role. Highly recommend taking a role like that to everybody. But it took a physical and mental toll. And it really, really had a toll on both of us. And now that I'm older, I don't want anybody to go through that. And to this day, nobody really asks me in an interview, what did you learn during that period? And that's the transferable skill and the additional added value that I bring. But nobody asks me that because we are conditioned to think certain qualifications and certain career routes are the ones that reward. But, I like to pride myself. That experience taught me so much emotional intelligence and empathy that most people don't have, that I'm able to offer something very unique here, but nobody asks. So when it comes to education, Susanne, I think there are certain roles, absolutely a qualification is needed. For example, I can't be a research academic, a PhD holder. But when it comes to certain roles, including leadership roles, there is no need to ask for certain accommodation. We should be able to look at people's experience, their journey, their transferable skills. There are ways to actually assess somebody's suitability to a job without asking for qualifications. So that's where I slightly say we need to rethink and reassess the way we assess these things.
Thank you. Critically look at what we're asking for in job descriptions. And Susanna, sorry, I see you have your hand up. I'm keen to move us on to the what can we do slide. Let me come to you first, and then we'll do that, Susanna.
Oh, I'll make it brief, but I do recognize and agree some of the things that Noora said. And as you said, Zoe, the job descriptions. Again, I would like to maybe differentiate a bit between the private sector and the public international organization sector, because in the international organization sector, in order to, be objective, to avoid biases, to avoid nepotism and all that, job description and the terms of reference are more or less set in stone, carved out in stone. So the selection process defined has to follow strictly those rules, and only candidates that are meeting absolutely or exceeding whatever requirements were set will even be considered. Whereas in the private sector, I cannot generalize for all, but I think I can at least pride myself in the companies I worked with that we were a bit more flexible. When we recognize a CV or a person that seemed to have an interesting background or had done some interesting stuff, we would be at liberty to call them in for an interview, to give them a chance, because we were not bound by the same exact sort of more or less set in stone type of selection rules. And there are at least, so all I'm saying is that at times, if you don't have, or you see, job ad after job ad where you think, well, I cannot meet these requirements, or I'm not, then perhaps look elsewhere where you have a chance to stand out and be considered without being, in a way, let's say, judged only by those criteria. So thanks.
So it sounds like, Susanne, there's criteria that are designed to be helpful in terms of promoting, diversity and inclusion, but actually are not always, from what you're saying. Grace, I see you've got your hand up. While you come in there, Grace, I'll pull up our next slide.
Very, very quickly, I'll make it brief. I think it was mainly to Susanne's point about the criteria in certain areas. Obviously, you're going to have certain things that are inflexible and certain things that are flexible. Where there is flexibility, and we're talking about some of it's quite rigid. Why is it rigid? We've got to think about why those things are in place and why they're seen as important. There's been a lot of research. I think a researcher, I can't remember her name, but I think in the 90s or the 70s created a concept called the ideal worker. The ideal worker is seen as male. They're seen as usually from the global north with a level of education. And I think this is what's happening in certain sectors. And it's not just this sector. I've seen it in so many different areas. I do a lot of work with widening participation and opening up psychological careers. I've been doing it for years. And I see the same thing. There's a very rigid understanding of what good looks like. But that in and of itself is discriminatory and biased. So it's not down, it shouldn't just be down to the individuals who are looking for work. It shouldn't just be their responsibility to look elsewhere, because those organizations that are supposed to be wanting to do the best, they can't, because they're consistently just churning out the same people, which is not necessarily bad. But if you want to diversify, if you want to be more innovative, and you want to create an environment where you're building solutions to problems, you have to have different voices. And the way you can do that is to look at your selection criteria and to look at what you're actually trying to do as an organization. You can't do that if you're consistently rigid all the time without due cause. And I'm not saying about those areas where you need to have some, levels of compliance, but even still, there is room for flex. One more thing is there is a movement, I think in the UK, called Non-Grads Welcome. So some organizations have signed up to this charter, which suggests that when you're having job descriptions and job ads, is it important to the role that they need to have a certain qualification to do that role? Obviously, like things like accounting and finance, there's certain things that you need to have in place. But if it's not important, can we take that off the job description? And if we can, we should. Where we can't, fine. But are there other areas where people can actually slot in? That's all I'm going to say for this one. Thank you.
No, thank you, Grace, and thank all of you for for the healthy debate. I think it's really important as we kind of unpick this and figure out ourselves also where we're comfortable to challenge and to how within the system. We are very keen that we end our webinar in our first final 5 minutes with kind of strategies for improvement. And of course, there's just some here. There are so many more. There's lots more in the report, but I think we could probably all name many other things as well. You may even disagree that some of these are strategies for improvement. I mean, I think mentorship is really interesting. Is that something that can promote more inclusion, or actually could it just reinforce the same behaviors? I think there's a debate there potentially to happen. I know coaching isn't specifically named, but there is a nice statistic in the report around the majority of people ask the question, is coaching important for underrepresented groups? Agreed. So I think there's a piece there to look at as well. Inclusive recruitment we've started to talk about, and in this discussion we're having now, I think there's more to say on what inclusive recruitment can look like. And an organisation like Oxford HR is learning all the time about this as well. I think there is, Noora, I think you mentioned at the beginning that there's an unlearning and relearning involved all the time, and I think it's absolutely the same in our sector and our industry. Salary equity, I mean, this was particularly noted, unsurprisingly, from certain communities and certain regions, particularly identifying salary inequalities with expat salaries and compared to perhaps local salaries. That continues to be a challenge. Board commitment is something that came up strongly, I know, in the interviews as well as the survey, in terms of you have to have that board support for EDI and inclusive leadership work, and it has to remain strong and central regardless of what's happening, with your kind of funding situation. And the role of funders is a key one as well, in terms of being able to more proactively ask for evidence around these kind of activities. And we have a session coming up, I think, on Thursday, specifically looking at funding as part of our Knowledge Festival. But let's, let's think about some of these strategies in positive terms before we have to finish, whether we've got any stories to share of where this has worked really well. Grace, whether you want to leave with any advice about how you could realise some of these things for people listening today. Anyone want to jump in? Noora, please.
Thank you. Strategies for improvement. I'm going to try and keep it as brief. I support all of that. I think salary is quite a big one. I don't understand how, as a sector, number one, not just the disparity, but we don't pay enough salaries for us to have a climate-friendly lifestyle. That in itself is just something I can't get my head around. And I think that goes back to funders' role here. And I would love to see that be a conversation with the funders, number one. Inclusive recruitment, mentorship, development, board commitment, all very much needed. But I think the thing that, again, I'm not seeing here, and I'm going to keep highlighting that, is that the role we as individuals need to play. As leaders, as people who hold positions of power, as people who are responsible for designing HR. HR is not just about paperwork, it's also about creating a culture. It's quite actually, an interesting field. If we are not ready to admit and be fragile and be willing to sit with the discomfort and be uncomfortable and say, we don't know something here, that's why we're getting it wrong, and go on a quest to find the thing that we don't know as an individual, not as an organization. So I think when it comes to this is one area where I would say it always needs to start with the I, not a we. First, it needs to start with the I, and then it needs to go into team, and then it needs to go into organizational. The biggest mistake I'm seeing is organizations writing policies and procedures very objectively almost like writing a health and safety process. And doing training tick box. It's a continuous journey, and it really needs to start about us. And my current CEO and my lovely allyship mentor and my boss, really, she said to me, we need to change ourselves before we can change the world. And I cannot sum it up better than that. We need to change ourselves before we can change the world.
Noora, that's such a beautiful way to end our conversation. I wish I had more time, Grace and Susanne, to ask for your final thoughts as well. I think we are at time, and I'm sure you agree with me that is a beautiful way to end, in saying it really starts with the I, and I think that's something that we all here and everyone listening can take away as a final thought. This isn't the end of this conversation, of course. This is a continuous conversation. Please do, if you're listening, look at our report on Monday, and we'd love to hear from you as well. Any surprises that you have, any stories that you have, anything that you think is missing, because we are all learning together in the sector how to have inclusive leadership in the environment sector and others as well. But of course, our focus today was on environment. So as we are at time, I want to say such an enormous thank you, Grace, Susanne and Noora. Thank you. Thank you for the healthy debate. Thank you for sharing so much with authenticity. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to having you again on a panel in the future. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and everybody listening also have a wonderful day. And we hope to see you at tomorrow's Knowledge Festival at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.